Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to CELDF's three-part webinar series, Nature's Rebellion Against the Corporate State. My name's Tish O'Dell, and I'm an organizer with the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, and I will be facilitating this webinar. Tonight we conclude the series with part 3, A Movement's Voice in the Rebellion, Decolonizing the Law, Decolonizing Our Minds. In parts 1 and 2, we focused on the rights of Lake Erie, both from the local community's perspective and then from the many communities who border her. Tonight, we want to expand out to the movement for rights of nature. And since rights of nature is growing in recognition both around the country and globally, in part due to the efforts of so many of your communities, we thought it would be interesting to have a conversation with some of the lawyers who have directly been involved in cases dealing with rights of nature in this Western legal system. What have they run into? Who do they think needs, or what do they think needs to change both in the people's tactics as well as in the legal system? And where do they see this movement headed? Before we get started, just to let you know, we're recording this webinar and it will be available for sharing on the CELDF YouTube channel and the CELDF website, along with the first 2 parts of the series. Also, please type comments and questions into chat and we will try to get to as many as possible before our 8 o'clock end time, but we realize that we won't get to all of them. And we're hoping that this will be a conversation starter, help to start decolonizing our own minds in our own communities. Tonight's format's going to be a little bit different than the other 2. Our guests will not have any formal presentations, but rather we will pose questions to get them started, and we're just going to see where the conversation goes. And before we get started, I would like to ask all of our attendees on this webinar to type into chat under all participants and attendees why you joined this webinar and what do you hope to learn or gain from it. We're hoping that'll, we can cover some of that then in the conversation. So I know you're all anxious to get started, hear what our panelists have to say. So I'm going to ask each guest to introduce themselves first, along with letting everyone know how and why they got involved with rights of nature. So Lindsay, start us off.
Hi, Lindsay Schroman-Warren. I am in Clallam Territory in the Pacific Northwest of North America in Port Angeles, Washington. I use he, him. Boy, where do you start, right? I was teaching field science education. I'd studied science and environmental studies in Ohio. And in that kind of framework, we're always talking about economy, society, and environment. And those are kind of these 3 rungs. We think of these, sometimes they've been framed as like the 3 E's. The B Corporation has like 3 layers to, what it should be promoting. And as I tried to work within that framework, I kept running into this, stuff that was somewhat deeper. And I was like, is it economy or is it law? And I'd known about the work of the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, during that period, but never really got involved or connected. And decided eventually, based on kind of studying monetary theory to some extent or hearing some lectures on it, that I wanted to understand the system more from the perspective of the law. That when we think of economy as certain driving forces in how society works, really those things are designed by fiscal policy and monetary policy and another policy, which means law. So I decided to go to law school, and I got connected with the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund during that time and helped with grassroots organizing in Spokane, where I was a law student. And in terms of rights of nature, I was initially skeptical, having learned about the concept from other white people. And even though I'd been teaching a lot with Indigenous communities in my home region on the Olympic Peninsula, I hadn't heard us talk about rights of nature in that way. So I remember distinctly being outside a grocery store with a clipboard trying to gather signatures on an initiative petition. And one of the measures in the initiative was rights for the Spokane River and its ecosystem. And a woman who appeared to me to be Indigenous was, walking up to the grocery store, and I said, "Hey, would you sign a petition to help give the Spokane River rights?" And she looked at me, and obviously I'm white, and she said, "Oh, you're finally figuring it out." And similarly, in that summer as well, I was gathering signatures, and this guy came up and was very attentive to like the language. He wanted the language of it, and he read it over very thoroughly. And then he pointed at that part talking about rights of nature, rights for the Spokane River. He said, "I'm a lawyer, and you know that this goes against 500 years of English common law, right?" And I paused because I was like, maybe he's underestimating the number of years. I mean, I think it's more like 1,000 at least. I mean, 500 is a little low, but I just said, yeah. And he said, good, because, I remember that first day of law school where, in property law, you're looking at the rights of a property owner, and the professor writes up on the board, what are the rights of the property owner? And the class kind of brainstorms it in that so-called Socratic method. And it's like the right to exclude others from your property, the right to use your property, the right to transact your property. And usually what ends up at the bottom of that list, because we don't want to think about it that way, is the right to destroy your property. And that as long as we treat ecosystems and the earth as a whole as property, we have the right to destroy it. That's, even if we go back to the diggers, that the earth is the common treasury for all, well, we can all collectively raid the treasury and destroy it. And so as long as we're working within this property law framework for the way that we treat the earth and the way that we treat ecosystems, I think we are fundamentally missing the boat on where we need to be. So since becoming a lawyer, I've worked on this as a big area of my practice and had the opportunity to work with a lot of wonderful people in different parts of the United States, mostly internet or national work. And it's great to be on this panel with everyone else. And thank you, Tish, and everyone else at the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund for having us.
Great. Thanks, Lindsay. Kira, how about you?
Hey, y'all. I'm Kira. I use she, they pronouns. I'm in Vermont. Excited to be on this panel. I think the question was how we got to this work, and like kind of similar to Lindsay, getting to it from like an analysis of power. And I got an engineering degree in my undergrad and was thinking about trying to solve problems in the world like resource inequality and environmental degradation through technical solutions, and then realized that all of these things already exist, and that because they've been developed by a system that benefits from them maintaining like the root of the problem, they're not really ever going to be effective, and that like we could structure our society based on compassion and logic and sustainability, but the people who have the power to make the choices about how society is structured have vested interests in not adhering to those values. So it's not so much about not knowing how to do it, but not having the power to do that. So went to law school thinking of, doing EPA stuff. No disrespect to anyone who is working for the EPA and maybe is listening, but I just realized that you're using the tools that the government has built and handed to you, knowing that they'll be ineffective. And we're all getting sweaty and running around playing whack-a-mole, appealing permits and all of this. And then I read a pamphlet from a friend of mine who was like, oh, check out this group, CELDF, and saw somebody else in that pamphlet using the whack-a-mole analogy and the regulatory hamster wheel and taking all of these phrases that I had been kind of shouting into a void amongst my peers in law school who had this reverence for the law that I just felt kind of sickened by. And so that kind of brought me to CELDF. But I bring with me, like kind of prior to being a lawyer, coming more from an activist community, fighting a pipeline that was trying to go through Vermont, fighting other development projects, and having gone through the process of, going door to door, mobilizing a community, packing a public hearing, and realizing that no matter how many people you can put in front of a microphone to, bring a compelling argument about why this pipeline shouldn't go through this town, it's really just how many lawyers in suits do you have on the other side, and it just takes like two, honestly. So thinking, okay, well, I'll find a suit, which, we'll see how that goes. But that was like kind of the reason for going to CELDF and using CELDF as an opportunity to like give movements the confidence to know that they have access to the legal system, but trying to do that without making them think that going to the legal system is the answer, because it doesn't, it's still using the tools that we've been given. So how do we say, okay, well, we're not really using this tool as an end goal, we're just using it as a strategy to allow you to keep pursuing the mechanisms for social change, like that are outside of the tools that have been given to us, and just being more of a buffer and saying, community groups, you do what you do, you define the terms of reality that you want to live in, and then we as the lawyers will come in and do our best to stand in the way when the state inevitably comes to crack down on what you've been doing.
Thanks, Kira. Will, how about you?
Yeah, hello. My name is Will Falk. I'm here on Seneca territory, one of the traditional nations in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, otherwise known as Potter County, Pennsylvania. I came to rights of nature work. I think it started for me as a public defender in Kenosha, Wisconsin, of all places, where I got to see how truly racist the American legal system is. And I learned how, as a lawyer working on cases at an individual basis, trying to push back against this racist legal system for my clients, I was kind of operating as something like a battlefield medic. I was kind of trying to stop the bleeding for those individual clients, but I was doing nothing to really affect the war. So I took some time and kind of thought about how I could do more to affect the war on life. And that took me to some Indigenous-led construction blockades. I lived for about a year up at the Unistoten camp on Wet'suwet'en territory in what is now called British Columbia. And then I also went over to Hawaii and lived at a blockade, stopping a telescope construction project on Mauna Kea. And while I was there, I asked everybody I could, you know, and especially Indigenous leaders and Indigenous elders. You know, I asked, as a settler who is starting to feel and has seen for myself how illegitimate I think the American legal system is. What can I do? What should I be doing? And an answer that I got a lot was that I should try to teach other settlers how the American legal system is illegitimate and how the American government occupies stolen land and works to keep Indigenous people from governing their own land. So that's something I thought about for a long time. And then in 2017, I had the opportunity to join a lawsuit that sought rights for the Colorado River. We sued the Colorado Attorney General, seeking standing in the rights of nature for the Colorado River. And I joined that, and my understanding of rights of nature has really been shaped by this, but my thinking in joining that was not that we were actually going to convince a judge to honor the rights of the Colorado River. But most people think that you can still step into court, or you can still use the governmental system to do things like honor the rights of the Colorado River. And the best way to show people how that isn't true is experientially, is to walk them through that process. And have them feel the disappointment when their lawsuit is inevitably thrown out, or when their law is inevitably stricken by a federal judge, so that they now know in their bones and blood that this legal system is illegitimate and won't protect the natural world that we all depend on, so that they can start having more sober and honest conversations about what it really will take. So that's how I came to rights of nature, and that's kind of the perspective that I take with it. I see rights of nature as a stepping stone to a more serious understanding of what it's going to need to truly protect the land.
Thanks, Will. Karen, last but not least.
Hi, my name's Karen. I use she, her pronouns, and Yeah, I'm based in Philly. I'm originally from South Florida, and before being a lawyer, I was working in journalism, and some of the themes that I was covering a lot were Indigenous rights, struggles of Indigenous communities, particularly in Brazil, the fight against the mega dam down there, and yeah, covering stories also in like South Florida, communities fighting to stop fracking in the Everglades, which is possibly the worst place you could frack. Not that anywhere is good, but so I was, writing these stories and feeling like, if people like getting people to read them, great, but like, what's it really doing, and that was how I decided to go to law school. I was operating on the assumption that the courts would really, writing to a court would be the thing that would really force people to pay attention and affect change. So yeah, so I came up to Philly for law school, and I should also say that I was following the work of CELDF from years before. I was really interested in the rights of nature work, and just thought that was a great concept. But then you go to law school, and they kind of beat all that out of you. And so I honestly think I'm still in the process of unlearning a lot of the stuff they teach you in law school. But yeah, I mean, I've been working with CELDF since 2017. I'm also doing, I'm also an immigration lawyer working with people in detention, people caught up in the deportation machine. And I have found that the struggles are very similar, even though they seem quite different. But in Grant Township, they're fighting to protect their community from a fracking waste well that a gas company wants to dump waste into their water. And in the case of the Berks Family Detention Center, it's ICE that's locking up parents and children who came to this country to seek asylum. And so in both cases, you have the bad actor, and then you have the state that is either doing nothing to protect people from these harms or actively colluding with the gas company or ICE. So it's been, yeah, over the past few years of doing both kinds of work, it's been very eye-opening to see how they intersect and kind of the scale of the problem, which, as others have said, as someone with white privilege, it's, I am late to that realization. But and I just also would say that, it's the work with the communities that CELDF does on rights of nature and other issues that is continuing to inspire me and keep me going when it seems like, the entire system is stacked against us. So I'll end there.
Thanks, Karen. I guess you guys can all get the picture that this is going to be a real interesting conversation with these four on here. And it's funny you talk about inspiration, Karen, because that's one of the first things people put in as reasons for joining was inspiration. And so I think it's interesting. You say you get inspiration from the communities and the people working in them, and they're seeking inspiration from you guys, the lawyers. So this might be a real good fit tonight. I think we want to start off, if people don't know, I'm located in Cleveland. And there's something going on in Cleveland this evening. So I want to start off with this quote that seems pretty relevant by Howard Zinn. He says, knowing the nature of the political and judicial system of this country, its inherent bias against the poor, against people of color, against dissidents, we cannot become dependent on the courts or on our political leadership. Our culture, the media, the educational system, tries to crowd out of our political consciousness everything except who will be elected president and who will be on the Supreme Court, as if these are the most important decisions we make. They are not. They deflect us from the most important job citizens have, which is to bring democracy alive by organizing, protesting, engaging in acts of civil disobedience that shake up the system. So my question for all of you is, how do you react to that quote, and how do you think it applies to rights of nature and the rights of nature movement?
Hey, so I think it's actually illegal to read Zinn quotes at this point if there are minors on the call. So, you know, any minors need to hang up because you're being brainwashed by Howard Zinn. But anyway, no, seriously, I mean, Zinn says the political and judicial system, if I heard you right. And that right there is part of the way that we're colonized into thinking that the judicial system is not part of the political system. It is a third branch of government power. And we're supposed to think of the legal system, the judicial system specifically, check on the other branches of government, that, you know, it checks the legislative branch when they pass a bad law or a non-constitutional law or whatever. It checks the executive branch when it acts with power that it doesn't have. We're supposed to think of the judges as the place where we go to correct the injustice or the harm done by the bad branches of government. And you know, unfortunately for where we're at now, because of the way that the US Supreme Court was arguably, and you know, there's a huge, I want to put like a lot of, you know, caveats on this, but it was arguably supporting civil rights and civil liberties, you know, in like the 1950s and 1960s. We can point to this idealized version of the court and actually point to realities of where, you know, Brown versus Board of Education, you know, decisions around, you know, defendants' rights, Roe v. Wade, you know, all these decisions that expanded people's, you know, liberties and ostensibly went toward justice. We can point to that and say, but see, that's what the court is. And fortunately, a lot of people are coming to the place of saying, well, wait, that was actually a blip, an anomaly, an outlier in the otherwise pretty continuous history of the courts being something that upholds social inequity, upholds existing power systems, gives the veil of legitimacy to those who have power, particularly when they're operating in the, you know, the corporate state, that merger of business and government that is ultimately the business of America. And so, you know, even in the way that we think about it, and Zinn said it himself, right, the political and judicial system, we need to say the political system, and it involves all three branches of government. So then as we look at, well, what do? We don't just turn to the judicial system and say that, you know, silver-tongued lawyers with the right case before the right judge are going to get an outcome that's going to produce justice. That's not the case. And for those of us who've been to law school, you know, we know that the word that is the maxim of the law is not justice. It is what is reasonable. And it's always been what is reasonable to white male judges, or ultimately a system based on white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. So, you know, to say that this is a system that's supposed to produce justice is just a myth.
Anyone else want to comment?
I think it's important to just like appreciate what Lindsay is saying about the courts. I really appreciate being with CELDF just to hear other lawyers who share this critical analysis of the law and acknowledge its roots in white supremacy and colonialism, and like kind of point out the fallacy in believing that it's just about getting more ethical participants in a fundamentally unethical system. That's not gonna work. And we can see this happening with the way that we are hyper fixated on just the smallest amounts of political activity that have been deemed appropriate by the government, where all of this pressure is put on us to vote, and that's all we're limited to as citizens, which itself is a word that's rooted in racism towards immigrants and xenophobia. But we as citizens are doing our civic duty by voting, and anything else is like, nope, that's not your role. And so often, like I have a bunch of criminal defendant clients who have been arrested for engaging in civil disobedience and protest, and what they're told is, you're doing it wrong. You were arrested because you should have gone to the legislature and asked them to do this for you, even though we know we can't keep going back there when the legislator is designed and has been orchestrated by corporations in tandem and in concert with the judiciary, all the branches of government and corporations working together to make sure that what they give us is performative scraps. And what they tell us is the way that you need to affect change is in these very limited and like deliberately ineffective means. And by this, I think like we can talk about RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and I, you know, no disrespect to the dead, but I think we can talk about how even her opinion that gave abortion rights to women was rooted in eugenics. Like her reasoning for passing that decision that was put in case law was about limiting the amount of Black children that could exist in this world. And we don't talk about that because we like to have her as a hero. And she is by far above and beyond the most compassionate person that has ever navigated the incredibly oppressive waters of the Supreme Court. And I appreciate her for that, but I think that it's not, we're screwed if we leave it up to a hope and a prayer that we have nice people in positions of power when it's a fundamental contradiction, because what do you need in order to get to that position where you're that powerful in the first place?
I would just say too that, you know, you talk about voting being one of the things that, you know, that's our only option. And now, hopefully, now that even that seems to be being taken away, or at least called into question. Hopefully the silver lining is that, you know, people see, okay, now I have literally no way to make my voice heard. I mean, I don't know. We're very entrenched in that mindset. You know, we're raised to believe that that's doing our civic duty and that's how you are a good citizen. And but I mean, people have to see at this point, you know, how ridiculous it is to believe that that's going to save us.
Yeah, I'll just add to that only because, you know, I'm in Ohio and we're fighting. We have initiative here. We're one of the states that has that. And it really gets you to think they're keeping things off the ballot now. So who gets to decide what's on that ballot if you as a citizen, and that's your civic duty to vote, who's deciding what actually goes on that ballot that you cast once a year? The people aren't having a voice in that, and someone else is controlling your choices. So to bringing it back to rights of nature, which we're talking about, groups that are trying to put rights of nature laws on the books, the system is now keeping them off the ballot, so you can't vote on those. Will, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, when I think about, you know, we're all, it seems like the left is really, you know, embroiled in the whole electoral politics thing. And I get, it's like, it's hard for, you know, those of us with different perspectives and on the whole spectrum of left perspectives, you know, we get frustrated with each other because you got, you know, some people that are like, you got to register to vote. And other people are saying like, well, you know, you're entrenching this illegitimate system if you're voting. And I think that's really important that we stay grounded in what it is that we're actually trying to do. And one thing that I always try to ask is we need to stop asking the question, what can I do? And we need to start asking the question, what needs to be done? What can I do might play into that later, but first let's ask what needs to be done. And to me, the most glaring and urgent problems that are facing us right now, what needs to be done, what needs to be stopped, are things like, you know, dozens of species going extinct every single day, thousands of acres of old growth forests being cleared every hour, more and more poisons and pollution being pumped into the water literally every second that passes. And so when we frame things as that is the problem, these problems out in the physical world, I guess we could see voting and legal change fighting through the courts as one way to do something about that. But those processes take a really long time. You know, if we want to look at something like civil rights in the United States, and a lot of people kind of confine civil rights to the 40s, 50s, and 60s, but we really need to see that as beginning with when the first African was stolen from the continent of Africa and brought to the United States. You have, you know, 300 years of resistance that ended has it ended? It still hasn't ended. So people have been fighting for civil rights, and we're still fighting for them today, which means that it takes a really long time for justice to be achieved, for things to be done through political and legal processes. So I just think we have to see that we're probably not going to vote our way to stopping those dozens of the species going extinct every day. And when we choose to engage in those kinds of tactics, we have to be willing to accept that all of those other beings are being destroyed while we choose those tactics. And if there are other tactics that may be more direct, why don't we choose those? Why don't we decide that it's unacceptable to choose tactics that take a long time, and instead choose things that are more direct, more confrontational, and hopefully preserve more of the natural world, so that there's more life left on Earth.
I just really want to lift up something that Will said. I think that every time Will says this, I think to myself, we all should be asking ourselves this question way more often. And that is what needs to be done, rather than what can I do, what needs to be done. And that's a Will original quote. And I would add to that too, asking, how can we do this ourselves? Because so often we say what needs to be done, and then we go ask somebody else to do it for us. And the people that we're asking are the people that are gonna smile and nod and say, wow, that really sucks, I hear you, and then just keep going and screwing us over. So how are we going to do what we need to have done? And how are we going to use, I'm gonna quote Starhawk here, how are we going to use our power within ourselves, our power together with our communities, to resist power over from making decisions that affect us without ever needing to get consent from us? And that's kind of what this really boils down to, is what do we need to do and how can we do it ourselves and with our own communities, and not relying on begging for permission, holding a sign day in, day out in front of legislatures and lawmakers and judges who are just living and navigating in a system where they're so out of touch with reality that they're just going to look to ways that they can make us feel like they're hearing us while doing literally nothing.
Yeah, I agree. And I was also just jumping off of something Will was talking about, where, that it's hundreds of years of struggle to get to a place that he said we're still fighting. But I mean, any major decision that you can think of with the Supreme Court giving rights like Brown v. Board or, gay marriage, I mean, those were preceded by so many years and so much continued struggle and direct action by the affected communities, led by the affected communities themselves. And that's just something to keep in mind, like an ongoing theme that I think Kira also said very well. And I mean, that's something we try to keep in mind doing this work too, is that, nobody is coming to save us. I don't know who said this first, but the quote, "There is no justice, just us," right? I mean, the lawyering that we do, it has to be led by an organizing strategy. I think CELDF does that model very well, and follow the lead of the communities. And the risk, like Kira was saying, the risk in thinking that the risk is the complacency that might come from the legal side. Oh, the courts will handle it, we don't need to do anything else. And then, the courts fail us. So just to keep in mind that, legal strategy has to be complemented by organizing and direct action.
Yeah, I want to try and piggyback off a few themes that other people have said here. And one is this idea of power. And, we use the word power a lot, but we often don't define it. And it can certainly have multiple definitions. But one way that I like to think of it is power is the ability to define reality. And so sometimes you talk about defining reality for you and people who you're with, your community. Sometimes it's power defined for you. And often courts work in that way, that when a judge issues an opinion, that judge has just defined reality. Is the pipeline going to go through, or is it not going to go through? The judge's opinion decides that. Does Lake Erie have rights? Judge's opinion defined that. Is a zygote something with rights? That's potentially going to be taken up by the U.S. Supreme Court. I mean, can somebody stay in the place where they're living? Or do they have to go back to some other place? I mean, all of these are decisions that we give the courts power to make these decisions because the courts define reality. Similarly, we are really good at abstracting reality and not talking about it and working in reality when we're working to protect the earth and protect ecosystems, which ultimately are reality. I mean, one of the contradictions we deal with is that the legal fictions like corporations have existence in the law, and yet the real world around us, the physical material of nature, does not. So we're fighting for ecosystems to get recognized in courts when legal fictions like corporations, which simply don't exist at all, have more power, right? So that's just bizarre, but that's our system, because ultimately at the end, our legal system is about turning nature into money. And you get hurt, you get money. Somebody damaged your property, you get money. The remedy is money. We've tried over the last more or less 1,000 or 100 years or so of like trying for injunctive relief and trying to stop harms through the legal system. But again, we're taking a system that is designed to take nature and turn it into money and trying to get it to do something different. So as we think about then what do we do either within that system or outside of that system, we need to focus back on the physical reality of what is happening on this planet. So are we creating more ecological function, more ecosystem health, more places for species to live, or are we destroying it? What is actually happening on the ground? One of our colleagues says that he doesn't use the term climate anymore. He talks about ecology. So rather than saying, we need to stop climate change, he says we create more ecological, or we need to stop ecological loss, right? Like, let's talk about it in terms that actually mean something for us on the ground, in the places where we live, in the actions that are taken around us, usually by the 1% who are causing most of this harm. And talk about it in terms that actually mean something physical in reality for us, because it's really easy for us to abstract, and all the powers that we're fighting, those with power, the ability to find reality, do it in these really bizarre abstract ways in courtrooms, in legislative halls, in corporate boardrooms. And so bringing it back to that reality is really important. There have been a number of great comments by participants, and I wish this was just an open conversation with everybody on the call, but this question about, well, what do protests do? What do protests achieve? And sometimes protests actually change reality on the ground. If you're preventing the ecological loss, or if you're preventing a community from getting torn apart by agents of the state, that is changing the reality on the ground for people. Like, stuff around eviction defense right now is keeping people in houses, and homelessness takes decades off people's lives. I mean, that's physical reality that can be changed through people taking direct action together. Protests also, and this is where we start to get more abstracted, protests also change the way we talk about issues. Right now, there's a conversation that's not just being laughed out of the political space about abolishing police and abolishing prisons. And I don't think that would be the case if there wasn't massive protests all over the streets throughout the United States over police killing, police murder, around commonly referred to as Black Lives Matter protests. Like, without that, I don't think we'd be having that conversation, potentially changing our goals and paradigms from which we're operating at, which is an abstraction, but can lead toward changes in reality in the future. So there's sometimes a give and take of, sometimes we are working for future gains in changing the way that we think about things. With rights in nature, we would have been laughed at years ago. There was a Fox News article when Van Jones became Obama's green czar, and because he'd worked with, I think, Pachamama on some rights in nature stuff outside the US, Fox News wanted to make fun of him. It was like, Van Jones and the Obama administration want rights for rocks and ha ha ha, right? And after a lot of organizing, some of us have been involved in that lawyering, but it's really organizing that has changed that narrative. And I think especially with the Lake Erie Bill of Rights getting a lot of attention all over the world, that now I've actually been interviewed by journalists for legal publications asking serious questions about, well, how would this work for the ecosystem to be in court? And who would be speaking, just like a corporation? Oh, I guess a corporation doesn't really speak for itself. It has lawyers and it has agents, and maybe the ecosystem. I mean, serious conversations with law journalists about this. So we've passed this realm of this is unthinkable, which goes back to the term that Christopher Stone used in Should Trees Have Standing back in, I think, 1971. And now we're in this era where we can actually talk about this idea because of the work that people did. So does it matter that a judge in Toledo said the Lake Erie Bill of Rights was void for vagueness? Maybe, in that, like, that reality put forward by the judge is that Lake Erie Bill of Rights is not law. But there's this other reality of how people are viewing the lake and what we think it should be. And is Lake Erie Bill of Rights potentially going to change the way that we work around and think about the health of a lake in the future? Very likely, and regardless of what one judge said. And so that's the give and take we have to have with the legal system, is recognizing that we're making gains on multiple fronts. And ultimately, we need to drive it into the reality of what's happening on the ground.
Well said. And Lindsay, I just wanted to take it back to Deborah's question, which was, is protest a strategic and effective change? Does it bring a strategic and effective change in the status quo? And I just wanted to give a concrete example from here in Philly from this week. So for the past few months, there's been a couple of encampments of unhoused people, and it's been controversial. The city has threatened to evict people several times, but the community has every time showed up to to protect them and to stop the eviction. And then finally today, the city announced that they would be providing housing for not everyone in the encampment, but it's a decent start. And so that's just one example of yes, this is not just people in the streets making noise for no reason. I mean, direct action does get the goods sometimes, oftentimes. So, and I agree with Lindsay, like we would not be having this national conversation without the protests that have been going on at such a huge scale. And I think it's needed. It's needed to keep refreshing our democracy, such as it is.
Right. It never ends, right? It's constantly, like Lindsay brought up, I'm just going to add this, a power shift, and it's a power struggle. So it never does end, and they all play together. The protests, like you said, I mean, they create awareness, and they obviously, if they weren't a threat, they wouldn't be passing laws to try and stop them, right? And to keep you from doing them. The Lake Erie Bill of Rights, if it wasn't a threat, they wouldn't have filed a lawsuit 12 hours after. So I always, like, as an organizer, tell people the things you're doing, that then you're getting a reaction from the state or the opposition or whatever. That means you must be on the right track because they're fighting to stop it. Kira?
Yeah, I just want to appreciate all of the people who, since George Floyd was murdered, have been putting their bodies and their health and their safety and often their lives on the line for this movement, and appreciating the question as well, and wanting to just make a note that we often see, I'm speaking as a white person, white mainstream society likes to point at specifically Black organizing around racial justice and categorize Black Lives Matter and that movement as quote unquote violent, which is just kind of obscures and puts a blanket over the fact that the state itself is the initial aggressor, that this this whole Black Lives Matter movement has been like just phenomenal for calling attention to the fact that police actually are an illegitimate source of authority and source of safety, and that it's the fundamental role of police is to protect property rights, and that property rights, like we've been talking about all along, are kind of the right to destroy. And the legal system today, it treats certain people, if you're marginalized, you know, you're poor, you're Black, you're queer, you're anything, you're disposable, you're expendable. Police are not really trained to protect you, they're trained to suppress you. And so thinking about the just phenomenal awareness building that's happening, like especially in the white community, by being exposed to these protests, and also just, you know, being firm in that, like any actions taken against state-sanctioned violence is self-defense and should, you know, be celebrated and encouraged as such. Just kind of pointing out the ways that, like, who comes to arrest the protesters who are saying, you know, we're going to lock down because we don't want this pipeline in our community. The cops do. Like, the cops come and they protect the industry and the profit at the expense of the community and the people and the water that are going to die when you know, there's pollution just dumping into their backyard. So really trying to tie all of this together and to say, like, it's also hard to see the benefits in things because, like, we're not given a blueprint for how to save the world, how to achieve social change. And we're, you know, the way that we're schooled in public education in this country is very, like, you know, follow the step-by-step instructions and then look to the teacher for, like, a pat on the back. And we're here trying to build a revolutionary movement where we save ourselves from impending climate catastrophe and from centuries of genocide and racism. There's no, like, step-by-step for that. So, like, it's really hard to see sometimes whether what we're doing, and I feel this way all the time when I engage with the legal system, like, is anything I'm doing worth it? Because there's no, like, positive feedback loop, and there's definitely no tutorial for this. So, like, being gentle with ourselves when we're not quite sure whether something works, of just, like, there's not always quantifiable benefits to things, but if we take a step back and we look more holistically, there's real power in what we're doing.
Yeah, sometimes organizers talk about organized money and organized people. And generally, we're not going to have organized money on our side, but we can have organized people. And the ability of people to redefine reality by organizing is so fundamentally important. We as lawyers can be tacticians in that. We can help to strategize on, well, this is how the system might fight back against you. So somebody put in the chat a story of gathering signatures and taking them to the city, and then the city clerk didn't do anything with them. And it's like, wait, this is a petition process. This is direct democracy. This is something that we have a right to do, but city clerk doesn't do anything with it. So what's your choice? You are supposed to go to court and fight a lot with a lawyer representing you, go through this process of trying to get the judge to say, no, the city needs to, you know, put this on the ballot. And, you know, that system for the last 100 years, and we can go into the details of this more if people want, but has basically been winnowed down and uprooted by the courts. So that direct democracy is really now at the whim of a judge as to whether they're going to veto it before the people get to vote on it. But, you know, the other question is, well, you know, why are we asking the city to make that decision in the first place? Like, are there options to run your own election? Are there options to create a kind of governance system that is more democratic and more just for people, rather than a system that I think was designed with good intentions by the progressives and populists who made it back at the beginning of the 20th century, but ultimately has been co-opted by the same people who it would limit their power.
Yeah, and just going off what you just said, I think it was Estonia, back when they were still under the USSR. They held their own election. They basically just created a shadow parliament, and, you know, held an election and acted as if they were independent. And I mean, that didn't go all the way in winning them independence. They still had to fight for it, but you know, they just acted as if it were true. I think there's a lot of power in that, even just in how it affects the community itself, gives them a sense of agency, and, you know, makes people realize, like, we can do this ourselves? Why are we looking to a higher power, higher authority to tell us how to do this? And then just going off of Kira saying, you know, how there's no manual, there's no checklist. I just wanted to shout out, if there's any, I don't think there's any law students watching, but if there are, one thing that was a good resource for me in law school was NLG, or even if you're a practicing lawyer, NLG is a great resource, Kira knows, you know, they have this disorientation manual for law students. And I think it's helpful to have that as you're going through and kind of learning all this stuff that you then have to keep in perspective in your mind, learning how like other people have gone through this before and managed to be creative within the system or outside the system. And yeah, so just wanted to plug that.
I was going to read, someone just typed in that they said, I've been amazed looking into qualified immunity for police, finding that was created without legal basis in the 1880s. As it is practiced today by the courts, it is impossible to assail. So people who have been wronged by the police have no criminal recourse. Is there a way to change this?
I can speak briefly to that. Oh, Will, you got it? Go for it.
I mean, sorry, if you want to, is there a way to change qualified immunity for the police? Well, yes, there is a way to do that, and that is to dismantle the system that need the police to enforce that system. So, you know, we have to look at this very structurally. The reason that there's qualified immunity for the police is this whole capitalist structure would fall apart very quickly if there wasn't qualified immunity for the police. If police couldn't use force almost at will with impunity, then so many things that the capitalist system does would be impossible. If the police couldn't shoot rubber bullets at protesters, then protesters could overpower the police and achieve what they needed to achieve. The system can't let that happen. So no, there's not going to be a way to reduce or change qualified immunity and still have this capitalist system stand. Those in power, especially judges, understand this inherently. And so I think part of what this is getting at, we've talked a lot about power. And I think we need to understand that those in power do not have power because they misunderstand something. They don't have power because they're mistaken or have been miseducated or something. They have power because they know how to take it and keep it. And one of the ways to do that is to protect the violence that police can use against the people. And so they're using this very intentionally. And I don't think that there is a legal argument within the current capitalist legal structure that one can make that is going to end qualified immunity. We're going to have to take power away from those who benefit from qualified immunity if we're going to end it.
Kara, did you want to add to that?
I'll just say really quick that we're trying to work on an ordinance that isn't quite done yet, but we're hoping to roll it out pretty soon. So definitely get in touch with any of us at CELDF if this is something that you are organizing around in your community and wanting to try to work on some local lawmaking to take a stab at ending qualified immunity in your jurisdiction. And that there's not really any surefire way to do it, but there's been like Colorado, for example, is passing a law that creates a cause of action that in the state version, it's like a state version of 8 USC 1983 that does not allow for the qualified immunity defense. So there's ways to sort of legislate around it and potentially ways to pressure states' attorneys into signing agreements ahead of time with law enforcement that they're not going to raise that defense on behalf of any law enforcement that do commit egregious acts that people sue them for. Although, you know, that all depends on will the local governments that we're trying to push these needed changes in go for that kind of thing, or will they kind of swat us off like we're not legitimate? And I think that kind of with this power conversation is the battle of legitimacy, and that's really what's in question here. Is we know police are illegitimate. They were slave patrol. Police enforce property rights and are, their training just like instills racism into them from, this systemic, like targeted attack on Black people and on just like human rights in general and on the environment. We know that, but right now in our society, police are winning the battle of legitimacy. On the flip side, looking at community rights, we're getting better. We're making gains, like Lindsay was saying, with that disparaging comment about like wanting to give rights to rocks. We've started this out doing very poorly in the battle for legitimacy, but the more that we can make our claims, the more that we can get people on board, like winning that battle of legitimacy, so that people revoke their consent to be governed by a system that doesn't represent them. But I think maybe Will actually might want to like talk more on this. Like sometimes there's a tension between whether we can change our culture without changing the structure that produces that culture. And I think Will speaks really well to this, and I'm sorry for putting you on the spot, but whether the battle of legitimacy can be won by like door knocking and convincing people to stop believing in the system that we're being steeped in right now, or whether we need to actually start changing some things about our physical surroundings in order to make that happen. I would love to hear from Will about that.
I love that question, and it is something that I'm obsessed with trying to answer. I think there's sort of layers and layers of this, and like a really rotten onion, each layer that you pull off makes you weep even more when you realize just how entrenched this idea really is. So one of the first things to understand about legitimacy is we have to understand that, again, those in power, the rich, corporations, they control our educational systems, they control the media, they control, as we're learning from the social dilemma, they control the information that we can find online. And they can bring vastly superior resources to bear to control the minds of the individuals that create a culture. So we are, as much education as we try to do and as much organizing and teaching that we try to do, the amount of hearts and minds that we try to change, to me, it seems very unlikely that we're going to educate enough people to change their minds about the legitimacy of the system when those in power can pour it through the TV, pour it through the internet, put it in the newspapers, and control educational systems. But I think that there's an even deeper layer to this, which is the human mind, which is maybe the smallest function of culture, the smallest individual unit of culture, is something that is created by our environment, whether that includes our human family members, and that also includes the habitat that we grow into. And there's really fascinating research coming out from eco-psychologists that are saying that humans that live in urban areas and don't have access to wilderness, they may not have the materials available to them to achieve optimal mental health. So that means that in order to help their minds grow into more health, to help all of our minds in this very urbanized world achieve optimal health, means we're going to have to change the physical environments that humans are raised in. But then there's also things like a lot of our behavior is very much affected by, sorry, there's a dog. A lot of our minds are very much affected by processes that happen before we are conscious of them, when we are in our mother's womb and in the first few years of our lives. And it really will take a drastic change into the way that human families operate and the community that they have available to them to change those processes so that humans again can grow into our evolutionary legacy. And in order to give families the community that they need, again, is going to have to overcome all kinds of obstacles from poverty to racism to the capitalist political and legal structure. And to make those kinds of changes in a purely educational way, when we are horribly outgunned by those in power in the educational forums, to me, we're going to have to directly confront those powers. We're going to have to maybe think about, we might not be able to achieve a mass movement to change people's minds, and then to start talk about what that means if we're not going to have a mass movement to save the planet.
Hey, I think jumping on that a little bit, we're, especially those of us who made the mistake of going to law school, we're taught to think of the law as kind of the thing that is controlling, but really culture and cultural patterns and social norms are way more powerful than the law. We can all think about examples in our own communities where there's certain patterns of how people behave that just are not in the law, or maybe even contradictory to the law, but yet because that's culture and social norms, like that plays a much bigger role. The late anthropologist David Graeber talks about his ethnography research in Madagascar, and he was living out in remote areas with, I believe, with indigenous people there, and the government would come and tell them how they should be farming and how they should be living, and they'd listen politely, and then the government official would go away, and then they'd go back to doing what works, because that's what works. And so we don't want to make the mistake of thinking that what's in the law is going to become what's in reality. And really, if we can change cultural norms or culture and social norms, often that can have a much bigger impact. That's not to say that we should ignore what is in the law, because as we know, with everything going on around policing, whether it's reform, transform, or abolition, that the laws and what government can do has a profound impact on people's lives. But we shouldn't ignore that the culture that we live in and the way that we think about how we exist as a community is as much, if not more, powerful than the laws. I mean, a simple definition of a law is just a rule that governs behavior, but culture governs behavior so much more than most laws, especially the ones that we don't even know exist out there, but then are used against us when we least expect it.
All right, you guys were on a roll there. One of the things I want to just bring up as an organizer, because I'm an organizer and I deal with this, and we do a lot of educating, and a lot of this is trying to, we talked about, the title of this, decolonizing the law, but decolonizing our minds. So a lot of the education is trying to get people to unlearn, what they've been taught, like you said, Kira. And one of the things when we're talking about nature and in the environment and things like that is we try to expose to people how the system set up this system, making us believe, calling it regulatory, that that's somehow protecting the environment. And what we've realized is it's really just kind of a hamster wheel they've set up for us, and it doesn't really protect the environment. It legalizes the harm. And so I wanted to know if you guys, how you feel about how does this relate to the legal system? Have you seen any similarities between that, whether it's even in environmental or even in some of the other legal work you've done?
So I really feel for you, Tish, because you have to go try to explain to people how the system works, and they don't believe you because it's so effed up that it's just not really fair to say. It's like, wait, no, we don't live in a democracy where like what people decide how they want to live locally matters. Like, wait, I thought the state can just treat corporations like children, like corporations, I'm sorry, cities and counties, like local governments, as if they're children of the state. Corporations can basically do what they want and have constitutional rights, that the courts just made that up, that nature is property and property owners have the right to destroy it. Like, you're just explaining the basics of a system that we've never been taught. And then, so it's training that and teaching people that. And that, I mean, I've been in democracy school where it's like there's so much pushback to just know that can't be how it works, because I don't want to believe it because it's so depressing. And so, you know, how do you get people beyond that place of, wow, this has just been designed over the course of centuries to disenfranchise people, marginalize people, consider some people not even people, and ultimately, you know, benefit such a small number of people and, you know, destroy the earth in the process? Like, how do you get people to actually have hope after that? Back to you, Tish.
Yeah, I know. I'm like, wait a minute, that isn't how this was supposed to work, Lindsay. Well, I mean, and it is difficult, you know, and it kind of weeds out the people who are willing to be in this for the long haul, because this isn't easy. I mean, it's difficult. This is really hard work. And a lot of times we say to people, it's because of everything we've been taught in that colonization in our brains. You know, that's what keeps us from trying to make any change. And then that's when the people turn to us and they say, well, you know, you have lawyers, you're a law firm, right? And so lawyers can fix all this. They somehow think that lawyers have all the answers, that lawyers can give them, you know, a step-by-step guide on how to fix the problems. And then, you know, I have to lead them through, like you said, it's showing them in their own communities how they run into these obstacles, but then they still look to the courts and lawyers as like somehow they're gonna find justice there. And so I'm, you know, curious, that's why I asked you guys that, how do you help me, I guess, break that apart in people so they don't think that the lawyers and the courts are going to, you know, fix this for them. And that's what they
say something, Tish, and then you just said everything that I was thinking perfectly. And I think that's like a really good example of this, is like stop listening to the lawyers. Like, let's listen to the organizers. Like, Tish is the one on the call who is like, you know, on the ground doing this work, and maybe we should actually just kind of like let Tish, you know, and I think that's exactly the problem, is that we have this idea that we should be giving lawyers this platform, that we should be taking all of our leadership and direction from them, and like that lawyers somehow magically know what to do. And we run into this all the time with town attorneys. Like, the city council will do nothing unless the lawyer greenlights it, but the city attorney is representing the municipal corporation, not the people of the town. So you have these local laws that are passed by the people in the people's best interest, and then you have the city attorney saying that's too dangerous. Not dangerous in the sense that anybody is going to die, dangerous in the sense that the town might get sued. And this fear of a lawsuit being one of the oppressive things about the legal system that makes it just like so awful. And I'll just say this, like, I hate lawyers. I think, you know, the whole system is designed to keep democracy inaccessible for the people that are being affected by the decisions that that you have to be a lawyer in order to make. And the whole process, every step of the way, from applying to law school, even going to undergrad, from all the standardized tests, from like, you know, sustaining yourself financially, taking the bar, that's just like all of these barriers to keep people out who are, you know, more on the people's side of class, and like, you know, keeping the legal institution predominantly white, keeping it predominantly male. And so just kind of like not looking to lawyers for permission, not looking to the law for permission, really just looking to what do you need, not what are you allowed to do. And then also I think, like, for those of us who are lawyers, just making sure that as much as possible, we tell people that, you know, it's the answer that you're looking for is not a legal question, is not what you need to ask a lawyer. It's what you need to ask yourself in your community, and what you need to kind of think about morally, and then hope that you have a lawyer with you to buffer the legal consequences afterwards. I'm going to stop talking before I get disbarred.
I just Somebody typed in the chat real quick. They said, we're always on defense. Wall Street is set to start trading water as a commodity. And I'm like, well, then let's not let them. Let's stop that. Don't let them take the water out of your community and bottle it and sell it. I mean, you know, that's kind of, oh, I'm going to probably get in trouble too. So Karen, you are on static.
I think Will and Lindsay were before me, actually.
I put myself on stack in regards to some of the comments about hope. And I wanted to kind of give two answers about hope. One of the answers is kind of psychological, and then one of them is sort of personally psychological. But I define hope as wishing for a future that you have no control over, wishing for an outcome that you have no control over. So for example, I say when I get on a plane, I hope that this plane doesn't crash. But when I wake up in the morning and I'm hungry, I don't say, I hope I'm going to eat. I just make sure I go find something and eat. I am lucky enough to have food. I understand that. But I think we're in a situation now where hope, we need to get beyond hope. If I look at the situation of the planet where, again, if hundreds of species are going extinct every day or every week, there's a murderer in the house and they've killed 2 of our 5 children, you don't go, I hope I'm going to stop this murderer. You just figure out how to stop the murderer. And I really do think that that analogy works, because the longer that we take to not stop what's happening, the less amount of life, both human and otherwise, is going to be left after us. So if there are ways that we can dig deep and not necessarily need hope, I think we need to do that. Now, people often worry about things in the environmental movement, things in the world being too depressing. And that is something that I do have a lot of personal experience with. I suffer from major depression and have my whole adult life. It has gotten so bad that I've tried to kill myself twice. So I've had to spend a lot of time in my life trying to get over depressing situations. My life is depressing, and in some formulations of mental health, I have issues formulating hope just on a basic mental level. But I found that I often have no hope that things are going to get better, and yet if I force myself to do things that I know I need to do, like exercise, like do work that confronts the problems that I feel hopeless about, like environmental problems, that is the best medicine for my clinical depression. And I think that works for people's just not clinical depression, when they confront what they feel as hopeless situations. If you have to force yourself to do what you know you need to do, begin to do that. And I think that the depression will abate as we go forward. I don't know, I just want to say that hopelessness is a condition that we can overcome. It will be very difficult, but if the future of life on Earth depends on it, and it is possible. Thanks.
Thank you, Will. There's a lot of great comments coming to all of us who are on the panel in the chat, and I think if folks want to make sure that we address what you're saying, put it in the Q&A, and that way I think it's easier for us to manage it, recognizing too that we might not be able to get to everything. There was a prompt about how we talk about rights in nature, and you know, I really just say, you know, right now in our legal system, we treat the earth and ecosystems as property. A property owner has the right to destroy their property. thus we're destroying the planet. I mean, it is a legal axiom, basically, that we're employing that right. Instead, with rights of nature, we would recognize certain rights for ecosystems, such as fundamentally the right to exist, and that would be something that would limit our ability to destroy an ecosystem. That's just off the cuff, but I try to frame it in that property rights framework. There was another great comment by somebody who I know has been fighting on these fronts for years, that the judicial system is or was the last hope for someone else to save us. And that maybe gets to the way that some people talk about hope as well, in that, hope is looking for someone else to save us versus saying, you know what, we're going to have to do it ourselves. We're going to have to restore ecosystems in the areas where we live. We're going to have to protect our communities from harmful projects. We're going to have to make sure that everybody in our neighborhood is taken care of. The various mutual aid projects that people are doing in light of the pandemic, looking at eviction, mass defense, looking at how do we provide for people and for non-human nature in ways that help to ensure that people are getting their needs met. We can't keep looking to someone else to do it, and yet, we find that all the resources are bound up in, the federal and state government systems in ways that are preventing us from actually doing what we need to do. So there's the question then of this existential crisis of who's going to be the next king in the United States. And with, King Trump, it really feels like there is no space for, any kind of progress coming out of federal and potentially state systems, as he effectively uses every divide to just bring us toward more of a dystopia. And so he's kind of like the supervillain. I think it's a DC supervillain who absorbs energy, and as people like try and attack him, he just absorbs the energy and gets more powerful. And so I really do think like people should focus on keeping him from staying in power, and I didn't intentionally say winning the election, because he is going to try to stay in power regardless of what happens in the election, regardless of how legitimate or illegitimate it is. He's basically going to try and stay in power, and it's pretty clear autocrat playbook. It's not like he's coming up with this stuff himself, but if he loses a position of power, he is likely going to prison. So what would you do if you were in that situation? Not like you're a narcissist sociopath or anything, but like, I mean, that's where it's at. So is it how did some people say it in, I think these were activists in former Yugoslavia at some point. They, decades ago, they were saying, in a fight between fascists and capitalists, which side do you take? And, that's unfortunately the choice that we're given here and who our king is going to be. But we, probably should try to make more grounds with, someone who isn't going to hit the accelerator as we're heading off the cliff. That doesn't mean that that's progress, but it means that we potentially have more time to come up with something better.
Yeah, and I would just say, in that formulation of it, I would choose the capitalist, because then at least I'll be able to continue to fight, not from a prison camp, presumably. But yeah, and this was brought up by someone in the questions, that we're divided to the point potentially of another civil war. What can community rights activists do? And tying into what Will was talking about with hopelessness, and I think that during this pandemic, everybody is really confronting. Everybody's struggling with mental health in a way that maybe they weren't before, and just the fact that there's no end in sight necessarily, and people are really coming up hard against that. And I think that what Lindsay mentioned with mutual aid and sort of the solidarity that has evolved in these last 6 or 7 months is really inspiring to me to see. And you know, it's a massive break from how we were all raised, not all necessarily, but how at least I was raised in a capitalist society, that it could even be possible to provide for ourselves and look out for each other in that kind of a way. And so it's a steep learning curve, and I think it is accelerated by the events of the political events and the pandemic. So it's one possible positive outcome of this crisis that we're in. And I think the reason I got on Stack in the first place was just to, when Kira said that she hates lawyers, you know, to say that I would love for my job to be obsolete tomorrow or tonight, because then I could leave the office. But, you know, especially with immigration law, it is pretty easy to say abolish ICE and, you know, open borders, which I completely agree with, and see how that job would completely disappear. With the CELDF work and rights of nature, it's a little harder to envision, but I definitely think lawyers as a professional elite class just should not be. I think everyone should have, this is my personal opinion, this does not represent the opinions of CELDF, but you know, that, you know, maybe the first year of law school is something that everyone should basically have. It's just sort of a knowledge of how things function, you know, for better or for worse, what the structure is that we're all living under. And yeah, I just think the playing field should be leveled in that way, and we shouldn't need this kind of guild with hazing rituals like the bar to be paid a lot of money to fight it out. So just, I guess I'll end on that note.
I can speak quickly to the question of commenting on the risk of how risk of getting disbarred works to keep attorneys in line. Because I definitely have had a couple of close calls with that, and just like recognizing that comes from like, and honestly, and this I think says a lot about people, like the insidious nature of racism in this country is that like when it has happened, it has been like when I'm speaking out about issues of immigration. Specifically in this instance, it was in a state that I wasn't barred in. But a lot of times I'll do things that go much farther to toe the line in environmental contexts, and there hasn't been as much pushback. So like recognizing what makes people afraid is not so much environmentalists. I think that as a stereotype, environmentalists are dismissed, whereas anti-racist activists are seen as threatening because, you know, white supremacy views blackness, views difference as dangerous. So recognizing that it's different depending on what kind of law you practice, but also wanting to say that it's much the same. The threat of disbarment for me is much the same as the threat of getting sued is to any non-lawyer, and that we all carry this fear together when we do this work. When you're thinking about if you're in your community and you want to pass a rights of nature law, you're going to have to sit with people in your community and think, okay, what if we get sued? What if we get a slap suit? What if the town, you know, tries to, like, what if people try to punish us for sticking up for our rights? And that's, you know, we just have more privilege to lose, but because we have a bar license in the first place. But if we didn't have one, you know, we would still face the same threats in other ways. And so it's definitely something that we're all in together. And I think like it is a fear tactic. And so like, if we do have this privilege, if you have financial privilege, if you have a law degree or whatever privilege you have, like, are you willing to risk it? Like take a deep breath and say, okay, like, you know, the most efficient way for fascists to get their way is for me to believe their threats are credible, because then I don't ever make them use their resources to call their bluff. Like I get so nervous every time I talk to the prosecutor, because I think she's just going to be like, I know you, like you're an abolitionist, and just like, you know, throw me in jail, even though there's not really a legal mechanism for that. And that's not super practical, you know, given the amount of privilege that I do have. Like, so thinking about that and really finding comfort in the fact that we're all doing this together and being willing to take risks, I think is really important.
there's this joke in the law, like bring your toothbrush to court, which means, you know, you might end up not leaving the courthouse and ending up in jail. But you know, ultimately it goes back to what is the legal system? It turns nature into money, and then what does it use to keep us in line? It uses the risk of money. So many communities say, well, we're not going to pass that law because we'll get sued. What does that mean? It means, you know, you're potentially going to lose money. The city of Toledo had to pay the corporate law firm for the attorney fees for those attorneys when they sued and were able to overturn the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, because in the law there's a provision that allows for attorney fees when somebody wins on their civil rights. And here we have a, you know, alleged corporation, and I could explain why I said alleged, but it was pretty made up, suing and getting attorney fees because it won on civil rights. So, you know, the threat is money, and we have to back up and say, well, what is that privilege for us then, that, you know, we're thinking, well, what do I lose if I get disbarred as a lawyer? I lose my professional ability to appear as a lawyer and represent other people. It doesn't mean I lose the knowledge I learned in law school, or you know, how to be an organizer in this work. But that's also privilege, and like I'm concerned about that, or concerned about money, or, you know, what's our community going to do in terms of resources when a lot of people doing this work in other parts of the world, or even in other parts of the United States, or even in our own communities, are at risk of losing their lives, right? So where are we situated in this movement to try to protect communities and nature, and what are we facing and what are we risking? I mean, I think that's part of the power of the movements we're seeing right now. Look at what happened for Breonna Taylor and the, you know, the lack of justice after the police kill her. Let's elevate those stories, because, you know, ultimately, what do we have to lose in these situations, and how can we create structures within our communities so that we protect ourselves? Because ultimately, this system is heading toward collapse. I mean, I think we just want to push that out and, you know, continue the Ponzi scheme, but we need other structures to provide for community needs. And, you know, the sooner we come up with those, the sooner we can jump ship off a sinking ship.
Thanks, everyone. You know, and I'll just finish that by saying, you know, I agree. I mean, it's like, what's at risk? You know, we're putting money, and that's again part of in our minds, and decolonizing, that money is the most important thing when we know Black lives are being lost, right, at the hands of police. We know that people in our communities, our children, I mean, are suffering because of poisons being put into the air and to the water. And don't we have an obligation to the future, that they have, you know, even a place they can live? So anyway, we could keep going, I guess, but we won't, because we're out of time. So I want to thank all of you guys for being with us this evening, and everybody who tuned in and typed in questions. And we hope this series on rights of nature stimulated some new ways of thinking and create some new conversation points in your communities. And please check CELDF's website and our YouTube channel regularly for updates, and feel free to contact us at any time. So thanks, everybody. Good night.